All right. Welcome, everyone, to the sixth in our series of solving homelessness webinars or solutions to homelessness. And we'll give people a couple minutes as they're signing in. I could really tell really bad jokes during that time, but I think I'll spare you that for a moment. Thank you for taking the time to come in and learn what's happening around homelessness. And this has been a fantastic series of webinars. I wanted to give a shout out to Monica, our director of, or our chief development officer, and the team of people who have been helping put these together. Raul, the amazing IT guy, Dr. Janich, who keeps us all in line, and Gabby, who's out there somewhere, who really keeps us all in line. Whatever Nicole misses, Gabby catches up on. So it takes a lot of work to put these together. So thank you for your doing that. We are in Tucson, so on time starts in about 2 minutes. And I will say I really like that about Tucson. I do my very best to never get to anything on time unless Dr. Janich and Gabby are making sure I do and chasing me around. So that's very kind to them. All right. So today we're talking about TPCH. It's not just an acronym. For years, TPCH, Tucson Pima Collaboration, and Homelessness has been doing amazing work in Tucson with a whole lot of people behind the scenes to make things happen. And this is sort of a time to understand maybe a little bit better because it's complicated. Anything that has the word HUD and federal dollars, it's a big red flag. It will be somewhat complicated. But we're here to kind of work through that today and really talk about what it is that TPCH is doing and potentially how you might be able to get involved in TPCH, because first and foremost, it is a community-driven entity and organization. Kat Davis, who serves as the TPCH Continuum of Care lead manager, is here with us today. And Lisa Floran, who is the chair of the board of directors for TPCH and the senior director of financial wellness. And we are thrilled to have both of you here. I will say I know both of these leaders. They are both thoughtful and compassionate leaders in the community. And so it's always a privilege for me to hear what they have to say. And I think you'll think the same way if you haven't met them before by the time we're done. So I am ready to pass this over. There will be a presentation like all of our other, if you've been at our other ones, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll try and field those questions. It can be in the chat. You can just, chime in or raise your hand and have a question at the end of the session. Or I have some really pre-planned torturous questions that I could ask. So if you would like to save these people from those torturous questions, maybe you have some of your own. So I pass it over to you now. Go for it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom, for having us here today. Excited to chat a bit more about TPCH. So let me just share my slides with you. As Tom mentioned, we'll go through this presentation.
Yeah, and I just want to hop in before we get going. It was
please.
very generous of them to list me as a speaker, but really Kat is running the show here today. So yeah, I'll be kind of chiming in. I'm on maybe like week 2 of being the board chair for TPCH. But Kat has been has put this presentation together over the past couple of months, and it's just fantastic. So I'm not going to muddy the waters of that. So
Well,
speak
thank you so
away.
much, Lisa. Lisa will be here for Q&A, so we'll have time at the end for Q&A for sure. She has a ton of expertise in TPCH, so we'll both be around for that. So hopefully you can all see my slides now. Perfect. So the first question, what is a continuum of care? So continuum care programs are actually required by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And continuum cares are designed to do these 4 specific things. For federal grant funded programs, this is a really unique program design because all of these, like the funding allocation, the regional planning, our coordinated entry system, all of that decision making sits at the community level rather than at the federal level with the funder. So that's a really unique program for grant funding. It allows us to tailor our homeless response system to fund the things that we think are highest priorities and to create service accessibility within our community. It also gives us the authority to do program evaluation of all of the agencies who have received this funding, as well as oversight, which again would normally be done by the funder. So this is a unique program here in our community. But the Continuum of Care, or COC, here locally is known as the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness. So COC, TPCH, Continuum of Care, those things are all interchangeable names for the same thing here in our community. And TPCH is a coalition of community members, housing service providers, government representatives, and aligned service providers. So folks who maybe aren't working in housing, but are serving people experiencing homelessness in their work every day. So the general council, the board, and committees all share varying levels of authority within TPCH. We also have a lived experience council that is made up of people who have lived experience of homelessness, and they advise the board and provide a lot of oversight and input into all of our programming. So TPCH is self-governed. We have a governance charter as well as written policies, procedures, performance standards. All of these things are upheld by the general council and the board. And so TPCH doesn't directly report to either mayor and council with the City of Tucson or to the Pima County Board of Supervisors or county administrator. Though we'll talk a little bit more about what the city and county roles are, because they do have kind of a unique position within TPCH. So TPCH has these 5 pillars of responsibility at system level response. So we'll talk a minute about kind of what systems level is, what that means in this case. But one is the resource allocation. So planning, rating, and ranking all of the applications. So when we apply to our federal funding for the Continuum of Care or for the youth homeless demonstration projects, all of those applications from our community agencies come to TPCH, who rates and ranks the applications and then submits that information to HUD. We also do needs assessment. We do a lot of work with our data. So we collect data through the point in time count, through our housing inventory count, through just all of the data that agencies are collecting on the clients that they're working with. And so with that information, we're able to kind of do a needs assessment in our community and identify gaps. So recently we worked with the University of Arizona's CERO team to publish our gaps analysis that you may have heard of. But that kind of outlines the problems of homelessness within our community. We also do a lot of planning. Currently, we're doing strategic planning, so I'll talk a little bit more about that process near the end of the presentation, but outlining our goals and priorities for the next 5 years. We do evaluation, as I mentioned, of all of the agencies who receive the COC funding through performance monitoring. We receive quarterly reports. Our Continuum of Care Program Grant Committee did site visits and performance improvement plans for all of our agencies receiving funding. And then we also developed the infrastructure. So we developed systems and processes to support the work of the whole system. We provide public documentation. We do coordinated entry, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. Our homeless management information system database. We do all the elections for the board and for the committee. So just kind of providing sort of that backbone for the entire system as well. So TPCH, as I mentioned, works at the systems level. So this means that rather than working directly with clients or individuals experiencing homelessness, we're really working on coordination with many partners, creating policies, making funding decisions, and building that infrastructure for the homeless response system. So agencies are TPCH members, like OPCS. They provide the direct service. So they're working directly with clients. They're providing them with housing and supportive services in our community. And so that's sort of the difference, is like the planning and the policy level versus like directly working with clients. So direct service providers also implement the work of TPCH through following the policies, utilizing coordinated entry, reporting their data, and also just helping work towards our strategic goals. So along with our lived experience folks, many staff from our direct service providers also are elected to our TPCH board or other committees. And so they also are providing their insight from their direct service and their knowledge to help create and build the homeless response system. So a little bit more about the city and the county and how they kind of are positioned uniquely within TPCH. So they each play multiple roles. So the first role is as lead agency. So continuums of care have two lead agencies. One is the Continuum of Care lead, and one is the HMIS lead. So for TPCH, the city functions as a Continuum of Care lead agency. Our work includes the operation and administration of the Continuum of Care, including planning, operating, the coordinated entry system. And coordinated entry is the system that we use to assess, prioritize, and then match people to housing. So we kind of support the function of that. The city is also the collaborative applicant, meaning that we submit the community-wide application to HUD for the Continuum Care funds. Pima County is the HMIS lead. So the Homeless Management Information System is a shared database that contains information about people experiencing homelessness, kind of like a medical record, but more of their kind of interaction with the housing system. As the HMIS lead, they operate that system. They perform all the data cleaning and reporting to HUD and to the community. They fulfill data requests, and they also enforce TPCH's HMIS policies. So as the lead agencies, both the city and the county also have 2 appointed seats each on the TPCH board. So they're represented on the board along with other organizations. We have 20 seats on the board, and so 2 are for Pima County and 2 are for the city. Lastly, both jurisdictions also actually receive Continuum of Care funding. So each year they receive this funding from HUD to operate supportive housing programs. So while TPCH is not governed by either the city or the county, both jurisdictions are very involved in the work that we do.
Can I chime in on something with that, Kat?
Absolutely.
And just to clarify, Kat might have said this, but just like underline it. Can you go back a slide?
Yes.
The lead agencies, they apply, right? And they're then approved. So in theory, it could be many other agencies that take on these roles, but the county and the city are the ones that have kind of stepped up and said we have the capacity and the interest to take on this work. And so, yeah, we're kind of lucky that we have such a big investment from our local government in splitting these 2 lead agency roles. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And I think in other communities, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. The lead agencies are chosen through an RFP process or request for proposal process, and then selected by the general council of TPCH. So yes, it's not a given that this would be the city and county, like in Maricopa County, for example. Maricopa Association of Governments is the lead agency, the COC lead, and another company is the HMIS lead. So it's different in every community. This is just kind of how our continuum is set up. So that's a great point, Lisa. Thank you. So if we look at the whole kind of spectrum of different housing solutions, it's important to understand like who TPCH serves and why we serve those folks. So let's kind of go through this. So we'll start with prevention. So the folks who are requesting prevention are housed, but likely low income and are facing circumstances that could lead them to losing their housing and becoming homeless. So they might have had a crisis, like a job loss or a medical crisis, that is now leading to financial or housing instability. Next, we have people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness and are living on the streets, as well as people who are experiencing homelessness but are in shelters, either congregate shelters or scattered site shelters, which is generally referring to folks who are receiving shelter services in hotels. Then we have the people who are housed through continuing care funded projects and are receiving supportive housing services. There are also housing choice vouchers, or sometimes known as Section 8. Those are allocated by our public housing authority. This is also a scattered site model, so people can receive a voucher and live in any apartment in town. It doesn't have to be tied to a specific building. Whereas with public housing, it's slightly different because the city is actually the landlord for that specific property. So it's a specific property that somebody would have to live in for public housing. Next on the continuum is affordable housing, and this includes both regulated and naturally occurring affordable housing. So regulated affordable housing is developed in partnership with the city or county, where fees are waived and agreements are made that keep the units affordable for a certain number of years. Naturally occurring affordable housing are just inexpensive units that exist in our community without any sort of subsidy or agreement. And in Tucson, this includes a lot of our manufactured housing. And lastly, there's a market rate housing, and this has a whole kind of spectrum of its own based on the local housing market. But it's important to understand this as a spectrum because it's like a change in any part of this impacts the whole rest of the spectrum. So it's all really interconnected, even though they have many different sources of authority and funding sources. They're all really interconnected in our community. So of the whole spectrum of these housing resources, TPCH has some level of authority over services that are designed specifically for people experiencing homelessness. So this is based on different levels of authority given to TPCH.
I was going to say, now say something saucy, Kat, but the recording's on again.
This includes our homeless prevention this includes homeless prevention as well as unsheltered homeless outreach and navigation services, sheltered homelessness, which includes our safe havens for people with severe mental illness and transitional housing for youth, as well as our emergency shelters and some rapid rehousing, which is supportive housing for up to 2 years. And then there's permanent supportive housing. This is non-time bound. So permanent supportive housing is permanent, and it's designed for people who are living with disabilities. So TPCH works a lot with the service providers, and we also work really closely with the Public Housing Authority. Some housing projects will utilize vouchers as the rental subsidy in their supportive housing projects, but the Public Housing Authority is separate from TPCH, and they maintain authority over both the public housing system as well as the housing choice voucher system. And then, as you can see, our nonprofit partners are really involved in all areas of housing. This includes outreach, supportive services for those people experiencing homelessness, as well as people who are housed, navigating clients through the whole housing choice voucher program or process to get them a voucher, as well as some nonprofits are also involved in developing affordable housing. So our nonprofit partners are really involved all along this whole spectrum. So because our continuum of care funding is really intended to serve people who are directly experiencing homelessness, TPCH has eligibility criteria for these COC funded housing projects, and these are based on HUD's definitions of homelessness. So to be able to receive supportive housing services through this continuum of care funding, you need to either be literally homeless, a youth between the ages of 18 and 24 who are facing imminent risk of homelessness within the next 14 days, or somebody who is attempting to flee or actively fleeing domestic violence and lacks the housing resources to be able to obtain their own housing. So there are many more people in our community that are and they have needs, and they may need a low income housing option. They may need to catch up on their rent that they haven't been able to pay, or whatever those things are. And those folks are really served through other parts of the spectrum of housing solutions, either through prevention or maybe through a voucher or public housing for folks who need a more affordable option. Because to qualify for our supportive housing services, you really have to be in one of these three categories. So within the homeless landscape, there are really very, very many funding sources that are braided together to provide services in our community. So the continuum of care funding, as I said, so we provide supportive housing. So this is a rental subsidy for the client, as well as supportive services like case management and resource navigation. There's also federal funding called the Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG funding. Those funds go to funding a small portion of the homelessness prevention in our community, as well as emergency shelters, rapid rehousing, and some outreach services for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. But other funding comes in to help support these services, including our federal funding sources, the city general fund through our PCHIP grant making process, state funding like DES and ADOH, as well as our philanthropic funding to nonprofit partners. So a lot of different sources are really coming together to provide our community with services. So TPCH's level of oversight really depends largely on the funding source. That's why I'm talking so long about who is funded by what, is because that kind of changes our level of oversight or authority over those programs. So the highest level of authority sits over the continuum of care funds. And for us, this also includes some special continuum of care funds that we have gotten in our community for our unsheltered homeless set-aside funding, as well as our youth homelessness demonstration project funding. And then we also have the Emergency Solutions Grant that I mentioned. That funding also comes from HUD into our community, and we have a role doing some evaluation. So we receive quarterly reports to our System Performance Evaluation Committee. They receive these quarterly reports on how the service providers are doing, and they also make recommendations for how the ESG funds are spent and what projects are awarded ESG funding. Then there's other funding that we don't really have any authority over, that may be philanthropic funding that goes to a nonprofit agency or other state or federal funding. And so we don't have any authority or oversight over how that's spent, but we coordinate with our partners and may have some influence over kind of, what gaps that's used for in our community. So the continuum of care funding for this year is $14.5 million. And this is allocated to our housing service providers as shown here. And of that $14.5 million, roughly $12.3 million goes directly to providing housing. The remaining $2.2 million goes to supportive services only projects. So these are projects that provide wraparound or supportive services without a housing subsidy attached. And then they also go to funding the two lead agencies, the city and the county, for providing support to the COC. So through this funding, last year, TPCH served 5,471 people who are experiencing homelessness in 3,892 different households. Of those people, 639 people were veterans, 640 people were actively fleeing domestic violence. An additional 1,017 people were domestic violence survivors. 1,111 people were chronically homeless. And 2,119 households were experiencing homelessness for the first time. So beyond funding and policy decisions, TPCH also has several programmatic activities that we're leading or coordinating or participating in. And so I'll touch on each of these programs briefly and just give you some kind of recent updates on what's going on. So we'll start with coordinated entry. So as I mentioned before, coordinated entry is the process by which we assess, prioritize, and then match clients to housing. So it's one of the main duties for the Continuum Care Lead team to do, to operate the system. And we also have a coordinated entry committee that helps make operational and policy decisions for the system. So to assess individuals experiencing homelessness, we used a tool called the VI SPDAT. And several years ago, HUD announced this tool was actually leading to biased outcomes. So instead of just fixing the tool, communities were given the opportunity to create their own assessment tools. And so that's what TPCH opted to do. We partnered with the University of Arizona to create the new TPCH housing questionnaire. This was created, and then they did some evaluation to ensure that it was giving us some equitable outcomes and was not perpetuating this bias. And then as of June 2025, this tool is now in use, and we have retired the use of the SPDAT tools in our community. And then in March of 2025, we also changed how referrals to housing agencies are done. Previously, if a housing agency had a vacancy to fill, then they would request a referral, and they would receive that information about one individual, and they would have to go find that person in our community so they could enroll them into housing. So now we are using a batch matching process. So we have an entire batch of people that are prioritized for housing, and any housing agency that that has a vacancy can pull somebody directly from that batch. The hope is that somebody on the batch they have interacted with either through outreach, they may be in their shelter, they may already be working with them in some capacity. And so they can quickly pull that person, get them into housing. And the goal of these changes is they're kind of twofold, but one goal is to get people into housing more quickly, that we're not wasting weeks of time trying to track one specific person down. But the other is that, you know, by shifting things a bit to the community level, we have some folks who are working as navigators. And so when somebody's on the batch list, there might not be a vacancy in a housing project available for them yet, but we know that they're next to be housed. So our navigators can work with them to get their IDs and their birth certificates and other documents they're going to need for housing, so that when a housing vacancy is ready for them, they're document ready and ready to be expedited into housing. So taking on some of this work at the system level helps our nonprofit partners by relieving their case managers from having to do some of this navigation to get somebody enrolled in their program. And in the past, this would have all been the responsibility of the agency to do. So currently we are working with the University of Arizona to do some additional evaluation of our batch matching process to see, how these changes are working. So I mentioned the unsheltered set-aside funding. So in 2023, TPCH received the special funding award that's for us to focus directly on people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So we began using this Housing Central Command model, and that really focuses on moving individuals directly from encampments into housing. So instead of going through a shelter system or requiring other things, it was a direct move into housing. This really requires a lot of intensive engagement and trust building with folks who are in encampments, as well as system navigation. As I mentioned, getting things like birth certificates and IDs, getting warrants quashed, all of that so that people can qualify for housing. So through this initiative, we've housed 142 people so far. Beginning in July of this year, just last month. The Unsheltered Initiative is focusing on the 100 acres area. So this has been a really large encampment for several years. But this fall, construction will begin to transform this area into a bike park. So throughout this summer, TPCH is coordinating with many community partners to come together and engage with the clients that are living there. So OPCS and Community Bridges are linking individuals who live there directly to housing. So the goal of this effort is to really limit the displacement that happens by just housing as many individuals as possible prior to the beginning of construction. So there are two other continuums of care in our state. One is for the Maricopa area, and one is called Balance of State that serves all of the other smaller counties and communities. And so TPCH has been working with them to build more coordinated statewide youth homeless system. So youth homelessness looks different than homelessness for families or for adults. They're often more transient between communities. They can be harder to find because they might be living on someone's couch for a while or kind of shifting between friends rather than living on the street. That's not always the case. Or living in shelter. But the goal of this youth homeless demonstration project and some new funding we're receiving is the youth homeless system improvement funding. And the goal is to build a statewide youth homeless system that has enough standardization between communities that no matter where somebody ends up in the state of Arizona, they kind of know how to navigate the system in that community. So much like how TPCH's work is informed by our Lived Experience Council, so is our youth work. So we have a youth action coalition here at TPCH that has youth who have experienced homelessness. And those youth will also now be working with our state youth action board to help inform the state system improvement work. The point in time count, you may be familiar with the point in time count. It's an annual event in our community where volunteers and nonprofit partners canvass the city and survey people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. This is actually required by Congress that we participate in this event and report our data to HUD. So this is a pretty imperfect method of documenting people experiencing homelessness in our community. But this data does help us to track trends and identify kind of how to allocate resources, or helps HUD also identify how to allocate resources. So this event occurs at the end of January every year. And while this data does have some pitfalls, because it is just kind of a snapshot of one night rather than really an overall picture of homelessness in our community, it can be highly impacted by things like weather, changes in local policies, immigration challenges. All of these things can drive folks kind of deeper into hiding and make them more difficult to find during the point in time count each year. That said, we can still glean really helpful information from this. And so each year we release our local data, and then HUD will also release a federal report that has all of the point in time count data from across the country. So let's look at some of that information from this last year. So over the last several years, while people are surveying people in on the street for unsheltered individuals, our shelter providers are also participating in the point in time count in the shelters. So this provides us with information on both sheltered and unsheltered folks experiencing homelessness. So in 2025, we did see a small increase over the 2023 and 2024 numbers, with 2,218 total individuals surveyed. That said, again, these numbers are imperfect, so small increases or decreases don't really tell us much about any kind of real progress. But what we can clearly see is that COVID significantly impacted our community and homelessness, with a huge increase in both unsheltered homelessness and total homelessness from 2020 to 2022, as captured through the PIC count. So since 2022, overall homelessness has really been relatively flat. One good sign that we have here is that unsheltered homelessness has decreased pretty significantly since 2022, while sheltered homelessness has increased during that time. So these are some signs of progress that our system has expanded its capacity to bring more folks into shelter. Shelter is not housing. We still want to see these folks moved on from shelter into housing. However, people who are in shelter are generally safer and more stable than people who are living on the streets. And our relatively flat overall homelessness doesn't really feel like a big win here. But when we compare that to what's happening nationally, we may be faring better than some other communities. So this is the federal estimate of people experiencing homelessness based on the point in time count for all communities. So as you can see here, from 2022 to 2024, the US has really seen a dramatic increase in both overall homelessness and sheltered homelessness, with a smaller increase in unsheltered homelessness. But as of 2024, levels for all three were higher than any time in the last 20 years. Though we don't yet have the 2025 report. So the number one driver of homelessness is a lack of affordable housing. And during COVID, housing prices increased across the country. Building and supplies continue to become more expensive, especially now with tariffs. So really, having more affordable housing options in our community may take a decade or more. And so this is to see, a really meaningful decline in some of these numbers, we're going to have to be innovative with our local solutions. A challenge that was also revealed during the point in time count in 2024, or more affirmed than revealed to people who work in homeless services, but something that showed up was that the complexity of needs for those experiencing homelessness has just been increasing. So we saw increases over 2024 in the number of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, severe mental illness, substance use disorder, and for those fleeing domestic violence. And so as people remain unhoused longer, the trauma and the impacts of homelessness only worsen. So this means that addressing the needs of our homeless population becomes more difficult, it becomes more expensive, and it becomes more challenging for our caseworkers, our case managers. We also see persistent racial disparities with our Black and Indigenous populations that are really overrepresented in our homeless population. And so those are challenges that we continue to address in our community as we move forward. All right, so strategic planning. TPCH's commitment to solving homelessness will be outlined in our new strategic plan. So we've been working since March on this new strategic plan that will last for the next 5 years. During the information gathering process, we completed a literature review. that reviewed other plans from the region as well as the HUD strategic plan. So we want to make sure that whatever we're planning for really kind of fits in and complements the other work going on in our community. Throughout April and May, we've held a lot of engagement sessions with the TPCH community, our elected officials, our line service providers, and then in July, we also had a public survey to ask the public to help us to rank our goals and what they think is important for addressing homelessness in our community. Our goals and our priorities were then adopted at our August General Council meeting just a few days ago. And this fall we'll be drafting the plan with an anticipated adoption date of February 2026. So the 4 priority areas that we have identified are areas that focus really on the types of relationships and partnerships that we want to be building across our community. So the 4 priority areas are individual and client experiences and improving those within the homeless response system, improving our own workforce capacity of the service providers within the homeless response system, optimizing and increasing the efficiency of the homeless response system, and then collaborating with our external partners on multi-sector solutions to impact housing and homelessness. So after adopting our priorities and goals on August 14th, our next step is to have our committees, our board, and our lead agencies kind of identify their action plans. So these are kind of the next steps that they will be taking to help us reach and work toward those goals. So that'll be happening the end of August. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have a draft plan this fall. There will be a public commenting period. And so if you'd like to have some input into the strategic plan, then that's a great opportunity for submitting your suggestions. So how can you get involved with TPCH? There's several different ways. One is our general council meetings. Our next one is November 13th, but this is the general councils are general membership. So this brings together some of our line service providers, all of our committees, our board, as well as members of the public. So all of our meetings are open to the public, and you're welcome to attend. And so yeah, our next general council meeting will be in November. And then joining a committee or board. So we do have an election process. The next thing that will happen is we have some midterm appointments to help fill vacancies. So that will happen in December. The applications will open. And then we also have our annual elections, which happen in the spring. I was talking about the point in time count, so you can always support our efforts by volunteering. The point in time count requires over 400 community volunteers, provides a really unique opportunity for you to also connect with your unsheltered neighbors. So our nonprofit member agencies like OPCS often also have volunteer opportunities. So if you'd like to get involved in your community, supporting our nonprofit partners supports the work of TPCH. And lastly, if you want to keep up to date on any of these things, if you want to know about the general council meeting or when we start recruiting volunteers for the point in time count, the best way to keep up with all of that is to join our mailing list. So you can go to tpch.net to do that. You can also follow us on social media. But that is all that I have for you today. I think we do have some time for some questions. So I don't know if you want me to hand it back over to you, Tom.
Yes,
To facilitate that.
I take total control again.
Perfect.
So thank you for all that information. It's very helpful. I know there's a lot to learn with TPCH. Any of these sorts of entities, as soon as you think you understand it, there's always something else to learn about it. So thanks. And I know there are a lot of people when we talked before that work within these systems that don't fully understand it. So it's always helpful. I do have some questions, and then of course opening it up, and I see Jen had a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Kat, but basically, can you clarify the TPCH impact of number of households? Does that total include those served housing assessments as well as those who were housed during the year?
Yeah, so that includes, that's not the number of people who were assessed for housing through coordinated entry. This is people who are actually served in any project. So this includes housing as well as emergency shelter.
Do you
Okay.
know, Kat, how many coordinated entry assessments we had last year? It was like over 7,000 maybe?
Yeah, it was just over 7,000 coordinated entry assessments. Yeah.
Any other questions before I ask these incredibly difficult ones?
Uh-oh.
No, no. I have a couple questions that came up. One is you spoke, and as we spoke before, um, and that is this. What I think is pretty amazing is this sort of constant number that we see with unsheltered folks. I know it can be hard to see this in our community because it is a crisis and we still see so many people who are unsheltered. But for any community in their point in time count, which we know isn't perfect, but for any community to see a constant or even a reduction, to basically not see an increase in unsheltered is really impressive. I mean, it really kind of says that we may actually be on the right track. Um, do you have any thoughts, either of you, on like why I realize it's complex, but why we may be seeing a constant? What is it that maybe we're doing right, or what is happening in the community that has resulted in this?
Lisa, do you want to start us off or do you want me to start? Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things is shelter. So we did see a big increase in the number of people who are in shelter. So maybe moving folks from street to shelter, I think is part of that. Um, we also saw a pretty big decrease in the number of beds available in our community last year. Thankfully, we've seen an increase now for 2025. Um, I don't think I think that'll maybe have a bigger impact next year on the pit count than it did this year. But through our housing inventory count, we did see a pretty big decrease as the COVID dollars kind of ended. All of the housing stuff that was provided through that funding went away. So that had a pretty negative impact on our community. Thankfully, now we've sort of made that up and are able to house more people again, which is great news. But I think that really the biggest change in impacting people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness is just our expansion of our shelter system within our community. As I mentioned, this isn't the end goal, isn't just to shelter folks, but when we can get folks out of the heat and out of the cold, and kind of connected a bit more closely to some supportive services, that does help provide some stability and safety for those folks.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just make another plug for the concentrated effort that we had over the past 2 years with like that Housing Central Command team. And there was a little bit of extra money that we got from HUD specifically to focus on the unsheltered population.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's a really challenging, population to work with. They have really complicated needs. And that effort was to put people directly into housing. But I mean, 142 people moved in compared to like what the overall unsheltered numbers are, I think is really impressive. And I don't know, we're not very good at no, I feel like no one likes to congratulate ourselves in this work because there's always so much more to do in it. But there had been some really, really promising like steps forward and partnerships that have impacted our work with that population, I think.
Yeah,
Agreed.
that's interesting. And I would agree. I am one of the worst at celebrating success, right? My primary focus and what I'm doing is trying to solve problems, and can sometimes forget to celebrate success. And yeah, it appears, and I would also say that some work that we've been looking at some numbers and such that Dr. Janish pulled together at OPCS here, it also appears that the number of persons who are dying unsheltered has been decreasing, which is kind of just reiterates this, access to shelter, and especially low barrier shelter, so that people aren't dying on the streets with these complex traumas, addictions, mental illness, um, chronic health conditions, and all these things that maybe existed before or were made worse or maybe exist because of, but either way, it's killing people on the streets. And that's, I think, really promising to see that reverse course a bit, because for many years that was increasing. So I think there's really positive things. Even my mentioning of it doesn't sound too celebratory. I should be like, "Yay!" Right?
No, that's so good to hear. I know that that's been kind of an ongoing thing that is often brought up at TPCH as something that everyone feels really motivated that we need to find a way to do better with that. And there are so many little strategies that I'm sure are contributing, and none of them like sound that like exciting. But like one, I'm like, I feel like the batch matching is potentially has a lot of potential to help with that too, of just how do we reach a larger group of vulnerable people more quickly, but towards the end goal of reducing mortality. That's kind of one of our driving overarching goals. So thanks for mentioning that. That's really good to know.
I mentioned that we created our own TPCH housing questionnaire that now we're using as our assessment tool. And how that was developed was really looking at lethality, like what is killing people in the streets, and then prioritizing folks who are more likely or more at risk for death. And so prioritizing those folks to get them into housing, to get them off the streets so that we can work towards saving lives and just preventing as much of those unnecessary deaths as possible.
Thank you. Gary, I noticed you have like a little X. I'm not sure what that means, but maybe you're wanting to say something or ask a question.
Can you hear me, Tom?
I can.
Oh, okay. I was having trouble with both the audio and the video. I gave up on the video, but anyway. Yeah, I was interested just back in the very early part of the presentation. Kat mentioned that there is responsibility in TPCH for monitoring programs in progress, and that there were metrics that were used. I was just interested in what some of those might be, and whether there's an example, like a good example, explaining how a metric led to a change.
Yeah, so a lot of our system performance measures are actually outlined by HUD, and then we can kind of create our own based on that. But measuring things like how long somebody is homeless before they get housed, measuring exits from housing. So when somebody exits a housing program, are they staying in permanent housing? Are they maybe ending up somewhere unknown or a temporary housing situation? And so what does that exit look like? And then also our returns to homelessness. So after somebody exits a program, are they then re-engaging with the homeless system within the next 6 months, within the next 2 years? And so all of those kind of flow through the system, are system performance measures that we're looking at. We look at them at programmatic levels, like individual agencies and programs, as well as our entire system. And we also have to report that information to HUD. So those are just some examples of some of the system performance measures.
Thanks. I have one other thing that you mentioned that the Vispidat got retired because of bias that was inherent in the system. What kind of bias was it?
I believe it was racial bias in the outcomes.
That's all for me.
All right, thank you for your questions, Gary.
Thank you, Gary, for taking the time to be here. I see Gary and Barbara Smith, who are wonderful members of our directors or board of directors, and it's kind of you to take the time to engage here today.
It was a privilege to hear it. Well-organized presentation and explained a lot.
Well,
Right,
that's
I'm
that's
happy to
all.
share the slides if that's helpful.
Yeah, so the presentations are always attached to our website, and we can connect it to YouTube. And so if you have slides, we can connect that to Cat, and we can connect it to TPCH and all of that. So
Perfect.
I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for the hard work and the success that we've had.
Thank you, Barbara.
thank you, Barbara. Um, the other thing, and I don't know, 5 minutes if you really have justice, can do justice to this, but I think, you know, what people are always asking, and this is a significant amount of money that comes in from HUD, is what's we know the future is in many ways unknown because there's just a lot of back and forth, unpredictable sort of things happening on the federal level. And but do you have any sense of what things might look like moving forward? What might be more funded, less funded, or is it still just kind of an unknown right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's for sure a lot of unknown. We are expecting a new notice of funding opportunity any day now from HUD. They don't like to tell us dates, so we all just wait with bated breath for it to drop into our laps. But we do expect to see some fairly significant changes. In previous iterations of the NOFO or Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Continuum of Care funds, previous iterations focused on things like racial equity and housing first. And based on federal changes, we don't believe that those things will be, given value in this NOFO. We're expecting to see those things go away. We don't really know if things like housing first, the housing first kind of model, which provides housing, and then the services are kind of housing is kind of the platform for which somebody can receive services rather than requiring things like sobriety or other services, like working, whatever those things may be prior to housing. And so this housing first model is, best practice, and we're really kind of turning away at this point from things that we know are best practices and are data driven. So that's a bit of a bummer, but we don't know if things like housing first will be banned or if it just won't be enforced any longer at the HUD level. But HUD has also said, kind of some silver lining perhaps, that things like outreach that have not been funded before through the Continuum of Care funding, they're looking into funding things like that. There's also a housing type called transitional housing that HUD really moved away from funding transitional housing in preference for rapid rehousing. And I think that there could be a place for both. I won't get into all the details of the definitions of housing types and, who they're good for, but they have suggested that they may be looking to fund transitional housing once again. And so we don't know exactly what that will look like, but there's potential for there to be some bonus money that we can apply for that maybe are under those projects. And so we will absolutely, we in the past several years, we have competed well for continuum care funding. And so things like the unsheltered set aside, as well as the youth homeless demonstration project funding, that was all kind of bonus funding that we got. We have two new projects, large projects, beginning this fiscal year, one through just kind of rapid rehousing, and then one specific to people fleeing domestic violence, and that was bonus funding. So it may be that this year we see bonus funding opportunities for things like transitional housing or outreach. So we've competed well in the past. We hope to do that again this year for whatever those kind of new opportunities may be. We haven't seen any indication up to this point that the amount of funding that we'll receive next year will be cut from what we've received this year. Again, I don't want to put the cart before the horse. You never know what's going to happen, but there hasn't been any indication up to this point that that would happen. And so, yeah, so we're hoping at least for the next year or so, year and a half, we will fare okay. After that, I know there's some interest in kind of combining some of these funding sources that exist from HUD. Some are formula funding or block granting, and kind of combining that potentially with COC. You know, that's where the unknown begins. We don't really know what that would look like, but we do think for the immediate future, you know, things are looking okay for our community.
Good. Well, I want to respect people's time as always. Time is an important currency. I again thank you for doing this and joining, and I thank our presenters for taking the time to share the information. I thank all the folks behind the scenes that are making this stuff work. Nicole, Monica, Gabby, and who else? Who am I missing?
Raul.
Oh, he dropped off for a second there. There he is, Raul. Anyways, thank you for all the, and thank you, Nicole. Thank you for all the back work that you're doing to make these work. We'll see you in a month. You did not. I had stupid jokes ready in case we needed them, and you filled the time, and you did
No, I
not have
talk
to
too
hear.
much.
You did not have to hear stupid jokes. It's a good thing. All right. Thank you.
Thank
Enjoy.
you so much for having us.